Welcome to Basic Food Theory and Product Knowledge. This is Lesson 12, Healthy Recipe Modification. In this week's lesson, we're going to be taking a look at some of the things that we can do to modify recipes to try and make the finished product a little bit more nutritious or more suitable for special diets. The challenge when we do this, though, is that we don't want to change the basic structure or essence of what the dish is in the first place. This is particularly important if, for example, you are delivering a banquet menu. You would like all the customers to have the same dining experience. They should have the same perception of value. The plates should look relatively the same, etc. But we will have to modify, change some of either the ingredients or cooking methods in order to satisfy particular dietary needs that we looked at last week. So let's take a look at some ways that we can do this. Uh, First of all, I think it's important to know that when we're designing menus and when we're looking at modifications, it starts right at the planning process, but it includes every step in the flow of food, from purchasing to receiving, storing, preparation, and so on. We can control or modify or change the nutritional value of the dishes. Ideally, we want to try and enhance the nutritional value and not detract from the nutritional value just by the nature of cooking itself and processing food itself. We may modify or change in a negative way some of the nutrient value. Our goal is to try to minimize those negative changes and make decisions to make the food more nutritious and healthy for our customers. If we take a look at this picture here, we can see that both plates are essentially the same. If two customers were sitting beside each other in the restaurant and they're looking at each other's plates, they wouldn't see any huge differences. The portion size looks pretty close to being the same. The components of the plate looks pretty close to being the same. If you look closely, though, you can see that on the plate on the right, we've got a little bit of extra bread. We have some olives in there, some pasta. You can see the plate on the right is actually almost twice the calories of the plate on the left. And by making some minor modifications, minor changes, we've at least reduced the calories and potentially done a few more things to enhance the nutritional value of the food. For example, with the olives, we're cutting back on some of the fats, so that's quite a large chunk of the caloric reduction right there. But also the olives, they're pickled in a brine, so you're reducing the sodium content and so on. We're reducing the carbohydrate by reducing the bread. We're reducing the carbohydrate by eliminating the pasta and replacing that with vegetables and so on. So you can see that we do have some way of modifying the dish, reducing the calories, making it more nutritious, and maybe including some more nutritional items. So we're going to be taking a look at some ideas about that today. When you're purchasing the foods, it's important to look at the ingredient list, look at the nutritional panels on the labels of different foods and see the differences in some of them. For example, here's a couple of nutritional labels. If you take a look, they're both for burgers. I don't know what it is about me and burgers. I really don't eat as many of them as you would think. But if you take a look, they're both 85-gram burgers. One of them, the one on the left, is 210 calories, and the one on the right is 123 calories. You can see there's a much larger proportion, more than twice the amount of fat in the burger on the left. There's 18 grams of fat, which represents 28% of the daily value of fat, and there's 7 grams, more than twice the amount of saturated fat, whereas the burger on the right has only 3 grams of saturated fat. Also, you can see that there's a larger proportion of cholesterol coming in to the burger on the left versus the one on the right. So if you're looking at these labels, you can make a decision on what's important. Sometimes it's a sacrifice of taste or texture at the expense of nutrition, or vice versa. And because we are looking at nutritional considerations, obviously we're going to favor the nutritional choice. Here we can see nutritional labels on two different types of canned diced tomatoes. So you might have diced tomato on your menu and just using the diced tomato as an ingredient in tomato sauce, in soups, stews, etc. And one of the modifications you might be looking at is reducing sodium. If we take a look at both of these labels, you can see that each of them is describing a serving size of 130 grams. You can see that the caloric value for each of them is the same. It's 25 calories per serving. Neither of them have any fat, but if you take a look at the sodium, you can see that the label on the left has 10 milligrams of sodium, which is only about 1% of the daily value that Health Canada recommends, versus the label on the right has 150 milligrams, or 6% of the daily values of sodium. All the other components, all the other ingredients, nutrients within these cans are essentially the same. You can see the can on the left has slightly more potassium than the can on the right, which may be significant if you're looking at designing a renal diet, but there's a far less proportion of sodium in these cans. So if you're looking at a low sodium diet or trying to reduce sodium because somebody might have hypertension, atherosclerosis, kidney disease, etc., then you can make a good choice, and you can clearly see how the low sodium tomatoes could be better. And if you compare the recommended daily intake for sodium, if we just take a quick look at this chart here, you can see that Health Canada is only recommending for adults 1,500 milligrams a day with a maximum of 2,300 milligrams per day. And you can see as the person gets a little bit older, the 51 to 70-year-old, 1,300 milligrams per day. Anyone over 70, 1,200 milligrams. Anyone who's pregnant requires a little bit more sodium at 1,500 milligrams. So you can see that's a significant reduction. If we can reduce from 6% to 1% of the daily allowance, we're going to be making our food more nutritious. We can take a look at some other things. Here's a couple of cans of soup. And if we look at the serving size of these cans of soup, you can see that each of them is 125 milliliter servings of soup. Take a look at the calories. The soup on the left has 120 calories per serving per 125 milliliter. That's about a half cup serving. And the soup on the right has only 70 calories. And look where the calories are coming from. We have 9 grams of fat or lipids in the soup on the left, and only 3 grams of fat in the soup on the right. And if we look at the saturated fat, we can see that there's 1.5 grams of saturated fat versus 0.4 grams of saturated fat. And the cholesterol, there's 5 milligrams of cholesterol in one of the soups and 0 milligrams of cholesterol in the soup on the right. So look at the labels. It's not only the sodium, but we can take a look at some of the other nutrients that we're concerned about. Fats, particularly saturated fats, cholesterol, etc. We can see that sugar, we have 1 gram of sugar in the one soup and 0 grams of sugar in the other. These are all nutrients that we should really be concerned with and look at when we're looking at labels on our product. We want to try and select brands that contain the least amount of fat, salt, and sugar, and ideally the greatest amount of fiber, dietary fiber or cellulose. And we're going to take a look at some ways that we can increase the dietary fiber and reduce some of those negative nutrients. When we're modifying the recipes, don't modify everything at once. I mean, cooking is a science as well as an art, and a lot of the nutrients, that the ingredients or the product that goes into the dish has to do with the outcome, or defines the outcome of the dish. It has to do with the structure, the texture, the flavor, etc. We can't just arbitrarily remove or exchange these nutrients and expect the dish is going to work out. Now, this can be especially true with regards to baked goods, but there are some reasons why we may want to have, for example, fats in dishes, and we'll talk about that. What we should do when we're reducing or modifying the recipes is reduce or increase the amount of the ingredient by a very small amount, try the modification, and see if that works. And if it works, then we can make further modifications to the recipe. If you understand what the ingredient is doing in the dish, if it's there for flavor, texture, color, etc., or if it's there for structure, if you understand some of the chemistry, you might be able to make more drastic changes more quickly. But if you're not really sure, then use some discretion, use some caution when you're making these changes. Particularly again with baked goods, they require more careful adjustments than the savory items, the casseroles, the soups, and so on. For example, if we drastically reduce the amount of sugar in a cake or the fat in biscuits, it may result in unsatisfactory products. Here we can take a look at what happens with sugar in a cake, a simple cake. With no sugar, on the left you can see that the cake is very dense, very hard, probably doesn't taste very good. I would imagine it's not an appealing item. And if we put a little too much sugar, you can see that it becomes very crumbly. The cake is, the texture of the cake is going to be too crummy, too crumbly, and probably over sweet. With just the right amount of sugar in the cake, you can see in the middle that the cake looks nice. It's got a nice fine crumb without being too crummy, and I'm sure that the taste is going to be just the right degree of sweetness. If we take a look at some cookies, you can see what happens if you add too much butter, too much sugar, etc. Too many particular ingredients are going to change the outcome of a cookie, and instead of having a cookie that's going to be enjoyable, you're going to have one that isn't. So be very careful when you're making these changes. And we're going to talk about what some of these nutrients do in food and some recommendations or suggestions on how we can reduce or minimize or make some exchanges on these nutrients. A reduction in fat or sugar may require a slight increase in the amount of liquid. Fats and sugars both help to maintain or hold moisture in the product. And if we reduce those fats and sugars, we are definitely going to have to increase the amount of liquid in the recipes. Every ingredient does have an important role in the production of a satisfactory final product, whether it is to do with structure, flavor, color, texture, etc. So let's take a look at some of the nutrients and see what they do in a dish. First of all, fats. Fats are when you're doing a calorie-reduced diet, the easiest way, or one of the easiest ways to modify a recipe to make it suitable for a calorie-reduced diet is to reduce the fat, because fat is the highest concentration of energy, of calories, of stored energy. You've got 9 calories per gram in any fat. So simply removing the fat from a dish is going to reduce the calories. The challenge is fats play a very important role in food. They provide flavor and richness. If you're using, say, butter, it adds a really lovely flavor to food. Duck fat adds a nice flavor to food, etc. As well as that sensation of succulence, preventing things from being dry. You think about eating a piece of plain bread versus a piece of bread that has some butter on it, and you can imagine the textural sensation is much better when butter is on there. In baked goods, the texture and the tenderness are improved. The fat promotes flakiness and lightness. We use fats as shortenings in a variety of different baked goods to shorten the gluten strands, to make pastries flaky, light, etc. And fats also make food smooth and creamy. If you think about, say, a hollandaise sauce or mayonnaise and the texture of those, or ice cream, for example, the 35% fat in a good ice cream, you can see how the fat really does enhance those sensations. Here you can see some beautiful pastry, nice and flaky. You can see big flakes. This is a pastry that's been made very nicely. As you've done in class, you've folded the fat into the pastry to shorten the strands of gluten, so you're getting a nice crumb, but also to help separate some of that pastry so you can get these nice layers and flakiness in a pie crust or in a puff pastry, for example. You can look at this cake between the ganache and the cake, nice and rich and smooth. You can imagine what this cake might taste like if we reduced some of the fat that's in there. It wouldn't have that same delicious, or if you will, and we'll talk about this later, delectable or decadent sensation. Eggs are probably one of the most commonly used ingredient in cuisine and many kitchens. We use eggs for many things. We use eggs for structure. We use eggs as a thickening agent if we're using, say, a liaison in a velouté sauce or a velouté soup, for example. We use eggs to emulsify, to help bind fats and water liquids together for doing up vinaigrettes or for doing up hollandaise, mayonnaise, and so on. Also, we can use eggs to add volume when the eggs are beaten. Things like meringues or anything you fold a meringue into. We use eggs for adding a shine to things, adding gluing things together. So eggs are a very, very versatile ingredient. There may be some reasons to reduce eggs, or at least change the proportion of egg in a dish, but we have to be very careful when we do that because of what the egg does in the dish. Here, for example, the souffle, you get that structure, that light structure of the souffle. When you heat the souffle, it rises. You get that leavening from and the support and the structural support of the egg in the souffle. A mayonnaise, I couldn't imagine a mayonnaise without an egg in it. It really helps that emulsification and gives you that permanent emulsion that holds and binds the mayonnaise together. For structure, for height, etc., in a chocolate mousse, all of these dishes would be a challenge to produce without the inclusion of eggs. Sugar, it comes in many, many forms. Every form of sugar does provide sweetness to a dish, but the sugar also helps to increase tenderness, browning through caramelization of baked goods, as well as in vegetable dishes and so on. Sugar acts as a preservative in jams and jellies and certain pickles. Also, sugar helps to feed yeast, which allows leavened products to rise in breads and pastries that are using yeast. So sugars are very, very important, a very important ingredient and nutrient. Here we can see this banana bread French toast. You can see the beautiful caramelization, not only of the bread itself around the outside crust, but you can see the caramelization on the bananas, and I'm sure the additional sugar that was added to that. So you can imagine just the sweetness and the crispness and the color that comes from the sugar in this recipe. A variety of jams and jellies, again using sugar as a preservative, but also to enhance and try to replicate that natural fruit flavor. You want to try and find that natural sweetness of fully ripened fruit, so we may add some additional sugars to these ingredients. And bread, you can see, you know, the nice structure of the bread, the air bubbles caused by the yeast consuming the sugars of the carbohydrates in the dough, producing the carbon dioxide gas, and then cooking around those air bubbles to give you that beautiful shape and structure, and that lovely caramelized crust, the crispiness of the crust, the color of the crust on the outside of that bread. All of those are a result of the sugar that's in the bread, or at least the carbohydrates that are in the bread. Salt. Salt is an incredibly important ingredient in many ways. It's the most commonly used seasoning in the world. We use it to kind of trick ourselves into getting that sensation of more flavor by adding a little bit more taste to things. It provides that sensation of a mineraliness that maybe is lacking in the food. So salt is an important ingredient. It does enhance the taste. It also has a practical application in the production of yeast breads. It slows down or reduces the action of the yeast when you're making up yeast breads. It also acts as a preservative in certain canned goods, some dried foods, some salamis or sausages, cured meats, and things like that, where dried fish, where salt is used to prevent moisture from coming up to a level that promotes bacterial growth. So it acts as a preservative. So all of these nutrients we say we want to reduce them for a healthy diet, which we do, but we also have to be very cautious because we have to recognize what they're doing in the dish before we start taking them out and replacing them with other things. So let's take a look at some ideas that we can use for the reduction of fat. I've talked about what fat does in a recipe. Let's take a look at how we can reduce fat in a recipe. There's a lot of product that is available in a low-fat version that doesn't necessarily impact the quality or even some of the other nutrients that you're getting. A good example is milk. Milk comes in a variety of different fat levels. From skim milk, we've got 0.1% milk fat, 1% milk fat, 2% milk fat, homogenized milk at 3.25% milk fat. If you're drinking a glass of milk, you can identify the richness of the homogenized milk with the 3.25 milk fat. But once you get used to it, drinking the 2% or even the 1%, you can become used to it and you don't find you're lacking. If you're using creams, though, you do need to have you need a 30% milk fat in order for the cream to whip up. If you try and use a 10% or an 18% or even a 5% cream, which is available for whipping cream, for example, they won't work. You can't get them to whip up. So your options then are to use other ingredients to try and replicate that thickening ability of the cream, gelatins and gums, things like that, or use the whipped cream. But for other things, if you're making up, say, bechamel sauces or using milk in other preparations, even things like ice cream, creme anglaise and things like that, custards, you can replace some of the cream ingredients with a milk. And for some of them, even a 2% milk can work quite well. When you're looking at things like sour cream, you can replace sour cream with a low-fat sour cream or even a low-fat yogurt. They're very comparable in terms of flavor, texture. They look very similar. The yogurt gives you the advantage. It may be a probiotic, so you might have some advantage with a live bacteria culture in there as well. The fat gives a really rich sensation in the sour cream, but if you're putting sour cream, say, on a baked potato, you get a comparable sensation from the potato with a low-fat or low-fat sour cream or low-fat yogurt. Here we can see some examples of a variety of sour creams, and they all have quite a broad range. The Gailey Premium, which is in the back left corner, that has a milk fat of 18%. The original is 14% milk fat. Gailey also has a low fat at 3% milk fat and a fat-free, which is 0% milk fat. So you have different options and different levels of reduction of the fat when you're purchasing sour cream or using sour cream in a menu. You can see the yogurt is 0.5% milk fat, whereas a common Greek yogurt might be running about a 9 or 10% milk fat. So you do have some options in using those ingredients, and sometimes they are interchangeable. You still get the sourness of that sensation with the low-fat versions of sour cream. You're just missing a little bit of that rich mouthfeel. But often, if you're using these sour creams in the preparation of other ingredients, you're not gonna miss it. One thing you can do is you can take a blend mayonnaise with some low-fat cottage cheese to make a spread or base for a salad dressing, and that reduces the fat content of a regular mayonnaise. Or they have now quite a large variety of low-fat or even fat-free mayonnaise that are available. You can see here this is a light mayonnaise that claims to have half of the fat and half of the calories of a regular mayonnaise. And they are essentially interchangeable. If you're using them as a base for a salad dressing, if you're using them as a spread on a sandwich, there's enough flavor and other textures around that you're really not going to be missing that additional fat that you would find in a regular mayonnaise. Take a look at how product is packaged, stored, and a good example would be if you're using tinned fish, particularly if you look at, say, tinned tuna. There are some lovely products of tuna that is packed in olive oil and a variety of different oils, and they are delicious, but you do also have the option of buying tuna that's packed in water. You can see on this tin on the right-hand side that it is packed in water. And if you're taking that tuna out and blending it to make, say, a tuna salad or a tuna casserole, you're not really going to miss the fact that there's no oil in there, because you're probably going to be having an oil-based either vinaigrette or fat-free or light mayonnaise to bind it together. Cheeses. there's a large selection of varieties of low-fat cheeses, partially skinned mozzarella and so on, Munster, provolone, etc. American cheeses, which arguably not cheese. They have to call them cheese food. But there's a large variety of cheeses that are available and can be used to help to reduce fat. Here's some examples, and one of these companies are selling. This is Kraft. They're selling their cheeses in small and portion controlled packets, which prevents you from consuming too much. But you can see there are a variety. You can see, 50% reduced fat sharp cheddar, for example. You can see light Laughing Cow and those styles of cheeses. So a light cheese might be an option and still give a very comparable or similar sensation when you eat them. What are we going to, other suggestions for reducing fat? Choose ground beef that's at least 80% lean, so less than 20% fat. So you can see this particular brand is showing extra lean, which is probably about 8% fat, which is good, especially if you're doing up something like, for example, a chili. If you're making a bolognese sauce, for example, where you're going to be degreasing the meat anyway, using an extra lean or a lean ground beef is a good idea. If you're making up dishes like tacos, etc., even perhaps meatballs or meatloaf, then a lean ground beef would be suitable. But remember that fat does play a part in the texture and flavor and mouthfeel of products. If you were to use extra lean beef to make, say a burger, here we go, back to burgers again, you're not going to have a very satisfactory product. You should have at least a 15 to 20% fat content to make a decent a burger, to get that nice juiciness, that succulence, that lovely mouthfeel in there. But certainly for many preparations, using the lean beef is a good choice. Cook out the beef before you, if you don't have lean beef, cook it out, render off the fat, drain off the fat before you use the beef in the recipe, and that will help to reduce the fat. But then you should be buying lean beef anyway, because you're losing some of your yield by reducing and removing the fat from the beef. Another option is, though, take a lean meat to begin with, not beef, such as ground turkey, ground chicken, etc., and replace that in recipes where it doesn't make that much of a difference. If you're doing, say, tacos like we can see here, there's so many other flavors going on in there with the taco seasoning, the spiciness, the sour cream, the jalapenos, the lettuce, the cheese, you name it. You know what goes into tacos. That if you use a ground turkey, you wouldn't really notice the difference. Similarly, you could use the ground turkey for things like chilies, for things like a bolognese sauce, because there's so much other flavor, so much other stuff happening that you wouldn't really notice the difference. And that way you are reducing the fat quite considerably by sticking to the turkey, particularly if you're using the turkey breast meat. When you are working with poultry, if you remove the skin, you can see this image. You can see some of that yellow fat that's being removed from this chicken with the skin. And the other thing is, remember that the white meat, the breast meat of turkey and chicken, is very lean compared to the leg meat, the thighs and drumsticks. So if you're interested in calorie reduction and fat reduction, particularly focus on using the white meat of those birds. And that also it dictates cooking is different. You retain more moisture with the legs. That's why they're great for braising. If you're doing coq au vin, braised chicken legs, etc., the legs retain their moisture, more flavorful, but that's a result of the additional fat. If you're going to be making those same recipes, cacciatore and so on, with the breast, just recognize that the meat's going to be a bit more dry when it's cooked. So you may want to consider controlling the cooking a little better, not cooking the heck out of it. Other things we can do when we're making up stocks, plan ahead so that you can refrigerate or chill the stocks thoroughly after they're made, and then you can degrease them easily. You can just peel the fat off the stocks, off the soups, sauces, and so on. You should really be doing this anyway, and this really helps to keep sauces and soups as grease-free as possible. If you're making a consommé, you really want to make the stock a couple of days ahead so that you can chill it, harden the fat, remove the fat, clarify it, chill it again to remove any fat that you've got from your clear meat and so on. And this is the most effective technique of removing fat on a stock is by refrigerating it. If you're in a pinch, and sometimes you fall behind schedule, you've got to rush and get things done. Once you've made your stock, you can dump some ice cubes into it, and then just use a skimmer to lift those ice cubes out as quickly as you can. And the ice will harden up and coagulate around those ice cubes in big clumps. And that isn't quite as effective, but it is still quite effective in removing fat from stocks, which you're going to move into using for soups, sauces, and so on. Trimming off any visible fat from meats, draining fat from cooked meats. These are all good ideas. Just, again, use caution. Think about what the fat is doing in the meat. If you're going to be grilling or roasting the meat, there is an amount of fat that's required to successfully roast or grill some meat. If you completely defat your meat, your steak, your roast is going to be very dry, stringy, tough, not very flavorful, particularly if you're using meat that's not well marbled. A really good example of this is a few years ago I was involved in a barbecue competition, and I was preparing a beef brisket, and we were cooking it for about 14 hours. And I didn't really have a lot of experience at this time of preparing brisket, smoking brisket or barbecuing brisket. And I did, as this slide suggests, I trimmed all the surface fat off the brisket, etc. Well, I ended up, my brisket wasn't that great at the end of the day, where I think it could have been very delicious and good comparing it to other briskets that other barbecue teams had prepared, barbecue teams with more experience than I had. Their brisket was delicious. It was tender, it was moist. My brisket was dry, didn't develop a nice crust because I took too much of the fat off. So think about what the fat's doing in the meat before you arbitrarily say, well, we're going to cut it all off. If I were to get a steak, particularly a ribeye steak or a strip loin steak in a restaurant, and it didn't have a 1/4 inch fat cap on it, I'd be a little bit upset and disturbed by that. I certainly don't want to have a 1 or 2 inch fat cap on it, but I want to have some fat on there just to keep moisture, flavor, and so on in the steak. Serve your meat and potatoes without gravy, or at least without gravy thickened with a roux or beurre manier. It's that roux or beurre manier, or if you're making a pan gravy where you're just developing a roux from the drippings in the pan, you're reintroducing the fat that's dripped out of the roast and then reincorporating it or putting it back with the roast in the form of gravy. So those sorts of gravies or sauces should be eliminated if you're trying to reduce fat. But there are other options for sauces that you can use that don't include any fat. For example, if you had a nice clear degreased stock, you could reduce that down to a glaze and use that as the base for your sauce. It thickens up to a lovely consistency, beautiful flavor, and it has zero fat in it. So that would be a very good option. A demi-glace, on the other hand, does have a roux in it, so you are still reintroducing fat. But a glace de viande has no fat in it and would be a really good choice. Just don't, when you're finishing the sauce, don't monter au beurre, because you'll just be adding butter back into it. And if you made nice potatoes, either the roasted potatoes you see here, or some people will have mashed potatoes and put a puddle of gravy on them. A well-made potato doesn't really need any gravy, and you can see the moisture is still in this meat. It's cooked to a medium. You can still see it's glossy, it's moist. Really no need for a sauce on this dish. When you're frying, particularly with sautéing, reduce the amount of oil. Now, by definition, sautéing is cooking over high heat with a small amount of oil. That's the definition of sauté. But reduce the oil even more. And a couple of things you can do is if you have well-seasoned pans, if you've got a blue steel pan or a cast iron pan that's been well seasoned, you don't need to use as much oil. Things won't stick in it. There are some pans that are coated that are non-stick that you might want to use. Just use some caution because there are some concerns, some health concerns with some of the coatings that are used. But recently there have been quite a number of pans that have come out on the market that are non-stick and safe. And so you can use those to help reduce the amount of fat that you're using. If you take a look at this comparison with eggs, instead of using whole eggs in muffins, we can take 2 egg whites and look at the comparison in the 2 egg whites. First of all, the whole egg has 78 calories, an egg white has 17. Now, an egg white is roughly half of an egg, so if we double that, we're still only at 34 calories for the same amount of egg white as in a whole egg, which is still half the calories. So just in straight calorie reduction, we're ahead of the game. We're lower in carbohydrate with using the egg whites. We'll have 0.4 grams instead of 0.6 grams. We'll have a little bit more protein, so we'll have some setting power. I have about 7.2 grams of protein versus 6 grams of protein. We'll have 0 grams of fat versus 5 grams of fat. We are losing on some of the other nutrients. If you take a look at the whole egg, for example, the yolk has the vitamin D, has the magnesium, the calcium, the iron, vitamin A, potassium, vitamin B6, B12. So we do have some other nutrients in that egg, but we may be able to find those elsewhere. Whereas the egg white is strictly potassium. So if we're using egg for, say, an egg wash or in muffins or cookies, etc., the binding power of the egg white is the same as with a whole egg. So you can reduce fat by substituting egg whites only. Other things we can do for reducing fat. Limit the use of condensed soups, prefab soups. We saw those canned soups and we could see one in particular, it was a large proportion of fat in there. If we use techniques like reduction for thickening, we can use slurries, for example, in some cases to thicken sauces, soups, as opposed to using roux. We're going to be reducing the fat. Essentially, if we're making stuff from scratch, we have a lot more control over the nutrients or the fats, the salts, sugars that are going in there. So if we can limit the use of condensed soups or convenience soups, sauces, etc., we can reduce fats easily. We can use, as I suggested, using just egg whites, but we can use buttermilk or milk instead of the whole eggs if we're doing a breading. So we could have a seasoned flour and then we just need something moist. Buttermilk is nice, adds some beautiful flavor. If you're doing a fried chicken, you normally are going to be marinating the chicken in buttermilk anyway, so it makes some sense to use that. But you can use milk with egg white or just egg white as a binding agent if you're doing paneing, and that's going to help to reduce the fat. Instead of butter, don't get me wrong, love butter, but it is a fat. So we can season or flavor our food, particularly vegetables, etc., with other things. Think about all the variety of fresh spices, fresh herbs, citrus juices, vinegars, wines, all these other ingredients that we can use in place of butter to enhance the flavor of the vegetables. We can take out some of the butter or fat, the butter or the margarine in cookies or cakes, and replace it with a fruit puree. And they work out very well. The sweetness, the sugar of those sauces do the same sort of thing of maintaining and holding the moisture, as well as adding some sweetness, etc., to the cookies, the cakes, the muffins, quick breads, and so on. Look at your cooking methods. Instead of deep frying, look at baking or broiling or roasting, especially with those techniques. With a pan, you can allow for the fat to drip off your product and it doesn't get stuck on the product as it would be with, say, deep frying, pan frying. So those techniques would be good to help reduce the fat and limit the use of pan-fried or deep-fried foods altogether. Think about breads as well. I mean, to make bread, you don't really need to put any fat in bread. You can just use flour and yeast and salt and water, and that's pretty much all you need to make a bread. But I don't know if you guys have made croissant, but when you make a croissant, it's like making a straight dough, essentially, like a bread dough, but then folding in a crap load of fat. So you get these nice layers, so you get this laminated dough. So as much as I love croissants, if I'm looking at reducing my fat or fat content in my diet, you know, I'd have to steer away from croissants or enriched dough products like brioche and so on. So consider the type of breads that you're using, and that could help to reduce fats. We talked a couple of, so long ago, I can't even remember now, we were looking at those fish dishes, and we're talking about using lemon with fish. But as I said, if you have a sauce with a fish, you really don't need or shouldn't put lemon. But conversely, if you don't have a sauce with a fish, many fish do lend themselves very well to some lemon juice or citrus juice or something other than a fatty sauce. If you're having, say, fish and chips, tartar sauce, many people enjoy that, but just using a lemon juice or malt vinegar can help to enhance the experience. It helps to cut the fat, makes it more digestible when you're eating the fish, and you're not necessarily, or you're not increasing the overall fat content by adding a mayonnaise-based sauce like a tartar sauce. Or if the customer insists, or if you want to have tartar sauce, take a look at a low-fat option for the tartar sauce. Similarly, we take a look at the sauces or the components that you're using when you're serving other fish, other than, say, for fish and chips, the deep fried fish and chips. But if you're serving some salmon or Arctic char or sole, etc., you don't have to use a sauce thickened with a roux or a sauce that's got a cream base, etc. There are lots of alternatives for sauces to enhance those dishes that don't include fat. Let's take a look at some ways to reduce sodium. One thing we can do is don't use as much sodium in our recipes. Don't use as much sodium when we're cooking. Don't use salt in your water when you're blanching vegetables, for example. You can reduce considerably the amount of salt used if you use fresh, local ingredients, fully ripened vegetables, for example. Organic vegetables, they just naturally taste better, so we don't have to cheat by adding seasonings to get them to taste the way that a carrot should taste, for example. So we can reduce the recipe in most recipes, or the amount of salt in most recipes. Just remember, think about what that salt is doing in the recipe. If it's in bread to reduce or to control the yeast activity, you can't eliminate the salt altogether. If the salt is just there for taste, then we can look at some other alternatives. I think, again, as we saw with fats, we add salt to food to kind of round out the taste, those 5 tastes, the sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, so that we can sort of almost trick ourselves or trick our customers into having a full flavor experience. Think about other things that have the same impact. Spices can do the same sort of thing. Different seasonings, different herbs, different vegetables, etc., as opposed to using salt. Think about the ingredients that we use, the flavor builders, the ingredients in our dishes that have salt. Celery salt, for example, seasoned salt, soy sauce, MSG, Worcestershire sauce, or bouillon cubes. All of these things, they have salt in them, so be aware of that. And if we're using those ingredients, reduce the table salt, the sodium chloride that we're putting into our food, or reduce the need to use these ingredients. If you've made, a nice flavored stock or a nice flavored sauce, or you've got other herbs and spices and seasonings, you don't need to use as much Worcestershire sauce. You don't need to use as much soy sauce, etc. If a recipe calls for onion salt or garlic salt, replace that with garlic powder or onion powder, and that way you're not increasing the sodium. And then you can just add, if you need a bit more seasoning, then you can just add as much more sodium as you need to get the right taste. But this way you control the sodium that goes in there. Make your own stocks instead of counting on bases, bouillons. I mean, if you take a look at these soup bases, stocks, etc., salt is usually one of the first ingredients you find in there. Now, there are a lot of brands coming out that are low sodium, no additional salt, more natural. Take a look at the labels again. Take a look at the salt, the MSG, etc. The first ingredient should be beef bones, or chicken bones, and then vegetables and herbs. So be careful, read the labels, and you can reduce the amount of salt or sodium if you don't use these, if you make your own stocks. Fresh or frozen foods are better, usually lower in sodium than canned goods. Canned goods usually quite high in sodium because the salt is used as a preservative in the canning process. Or you can take a look for low salt or low sodium canned foods. But generally speaking, from a nutritional standpoint, frozen vegetables, for example, or frozen fruit are more nutritional even than a lot of fresh that you're getting, and definitely more nutritional than the canned equivalents. These products are picked at their peak of ripeness and they're flash frozen immediately, so that all the nutrients that they had developed in their growth are at their full values, versus fresh, where the product might be picked before it's fully ripened so that it can be shipped without deterioration. And canned goods, they just deteriorate in the cans, and with the additional sodium and other preservatives, make them not the best choice. If you're using processed meats, if you're using cold cuts, for example, use them sparingly, use them occasionally. I hate to say it because I love it, but bacon is probably one of the worst things from a health standpoint that you can eat. Use it more sparingly. Oh, and potato chips, nothing like some unsalted Miss Vicky's. You can see a lot of other brands that are making a no salt or unsalted version of potato chips. To reduce sugar, we can almost take out about a third of the sugar in most recipes, and the recipes are still going to work. That's one way to do it. But don't forget all sugars. Think about not just the white granulated table sugar, but any sugar that might go into the recipe, and that could be brown sugar, syrups, corn syrup, honey, molasses, etc. If you're using canned fruit, you can replace or not use the fruits packed in heavy syrup. Use fruits packed, for example, you can see these peaches. There's a light peaches that are sliced with no added sugar at all. They're just all natural. And then you can a little bit more sugar with the light syrup, and then with the fruit juice, which would be a more sweetened version. But you do have different alternatives, different options. And depending on your application, you're usually better off with the low syrup or the no syrup choice. Jams and jellies, that they have a lot of sugar just by the nature of how they're prepared. Flavored gelatins, Jello, a lot of sugar in there. So just reduce the use of those. You don't have to go crazy. Think about what the jam is doing on a dish. Instead of using it as a spread on, say, an hors d'oeuvre or a small cracker, for example, use it as just a little dot of a garnish on top instead of on the bottom, and that's going to help to minimize the sugar. So think about where you can reduce the use of those items. Quick breads, fruit breads, zucchini bread or banana bread, or different types of fruit breads and quick breads, etc., have less sugar and require less sugar in their preparation than cakes or that are really high in sugar, and cookies that are very high in sugar. So those might be a good alternative for desserts or coffee break snacks and things like that. And think about, instead of being very fancy and always having to produce baked goods or cakes or ice creams and those sorts of desserts, think about fresh fruit. Now with the transportation system and the availability, we can get fruit from almost anywhere in the world. There's such diversity. And we can be creative with using the fresh fruit rather than the prepared desserts, and that's going to help to reduce sugar. uh, we want to increase fiber. That was a recommendation. We're going to reduce all the fat, the salt, the sugar, but also we want to increase fiber. So let's take a look at some of the options for increasing fiber in our menus. We can substitute whole wheat flour for up to half of the all-purpose flour in most of the bread recipes. That whole wheat's got the bran on there, which is where your cellulose, your dietary fiber, is located. If you're using white flours, generally speaking, well, by definition, the bran has been removed, so you're not getting that dietary fiber. So this would be a good choice, using whole wheat or whole grain flour. It works in most cases. You have to modify your recipe a little bit because the leavening isn't going to be exactly the same. But generally the flavor is better when you're using the whole wheat. You get a more rich, fuller flavor. So that can certainly be done. Take a look at where you can. For example, chili is a great way of doing this. Take out some of the meat and add legumes, some kidney beans, pinto beans, black beans, etc. They're a really good source of dietary fiber, whereas meat isn't. Animal products don't contain dietary fiber. So replace some of the meat with beans and you won't know the difference when you're eating them. When you're using potatoes, keep the skins on if you can. Instead of using the really refined puree potatoes, the Duchesse potatoes, the smashed potatoes might be a better choice. When you're even making French fries, keep the skins on. That's where you get your dietary fiber from. Not to say French fries are a healthy choice, but they can be a little bit more healthy by keeping the skins on. Add fruit to anything you can with the skins on. So, for example, you're making a dressing, a turkey dressing. Put some celery in there, but don't peel it. Leave the cellulose on it. Put diced apple in there. Leave the skin on there. With the raisins, put them in there, or cranberries, or whatever it is that you're putting in there. So think about where you can add fruit to not just sweets, not just cookies, and not just cakes and so on, but there's a lot of savory items that can benefit very well from fruit. In fact, when you're looking for alternative sauces, things like relishes and chutneys and so on might be a really good choice for certain things instead of relying on the typical fluid kind of sauces. Oatmeal. Use oatmeal instead of breadcrumbs when you're extending meatloaf or meatballs. The oatmeal is a good source of dietary fiber. Don't give up on vegetables. Crudité, good choices. Broccoli, cauliflower, etc. Celery, those are all really good sources of cellulose, dietary fiber. And when you have cereals, mixed cereals like muesli or things like that, top them with some fresh or frozen fruit with the skins on. Don't overprocess, well, except for bananas, of course, peel the bananas. But think about things like the peaches, the blueberries, etc. with the skins on. Dried apricots, things like that. Very good sources of cellulose, dietary fiber. Well, I hope that helped you to understand some of the concepts about modifying recipes, modifying menus for special dietary needs. That's exactly what your assignment is all about. Remember, the whole thing is you want to try not to change the structure or the visual aspect, the presentation of the dishes when you make these modifications. You still want to provide your guest with pleasure and a perception of value when they're served their dish. This was the last lesson in the course. I hope you've enjoyed it. Next week, your assignment is due. Remember, the assignment is due on Tuesday before 11 a.m. It needs to be emailed to me before 11 a.m. on Tuesday, December 15th. I won't accept any submissions after 11 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday. So that's due next week. Also next week we have our last test, test 3. Test 3 is a 100-question test. It's the same format as the 2 previous tests. The test is multiple choice true false. It contains questions about everything from the beginning of the course to this last lesson, including information that you should have derived from your assignment. You'll be given 2 hours to write the test. The test will be made available from 8 o'clock in the morning on Monday next week till Friday at midnight next week. Once you've started the test, you'll have to complete it in one sitting. And if you start it late and the time runs out at midnight on Friday, you won't be given an extension. So please make sure you try and get on to the test early. Unfortunately, the course had to be delivered as it was, in the format that it was. I didn't have the opportunity of meeting many of you. Some of you I ran across in the halls and in the kitchens. I hope you've enjoyed the course. I'll be working with most of you next semester in the advanced version of this course, as well as kitchen management. So I look forward to doing that. In the meantime, I hope you have a great holiday. Be safe. Enjoy yourselves as much as you can. And I look forward to working with you again in the winter. Take care.